Welcome to the Vital Spirit podcast. I'm Dr. Kelly Livingston, a naturopathic physician and your guide to a new health reality, one that connects body, mind, and spirit. Together, we'll dive deep into the art and science of holistic healing. Through working with hundreds of women through midlife transitions, I've discovered something profound. Most of our physical and emotional challenges are rooted in a maladaptive stress response. And true healing begins when we regulate our nervous system. Each episode will explore complex health topics in simple, empowering ways, uncover the deeper wisdom within each of us, and share practical tools for nervous system regulation to help you awaken your vital force and create lasting wellness. So, if you're ready to reconnect with yourself, your health, and your purpose, let's begin this journey together so you can experience life more fully human and deeply healed. If you've ever said to yourself, I eat healthy, but I still feel inflamed, or I eat clean, but I still have gut issues, or skin issues, or brain fog, then this episode is for you. Today, we're getting crystal clear on the difference between food allergies, food sensitivities, and food intolerances, and why decoding them is one of the fastest ways to calm the gut-brain axis, regulate your nervous system, and get into a healing state. Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Livingston, and this is the Vital Spirit podcast. Over the last few decades, reactions to foods have been on the rise. I'm sure you've noticed this. More than 32 million Americans live with a diagnosed food allergy, and about 1 in 13 children are impacted by food allergies. Allergies can range from mild to severe, but they always deserve a lot of respect. Addressing reactions through strategic elimination, gut repair, and nervous system regulation can change how your body interprets food. Because food is not just fuel, it's code. In this episode, we'll talk about different types of food sensitivity testing and what a food sensitivity even is. And we'll talk about what's helpful in this realm of testing and what's not, and how I use tests clinically today as a licensed naturopathic doctor. We'll explore the celiac spectrum from classic celiac to non-celiac gluten sensitivity to simple gluten intolerance, and I'll share many of my success stories reversing things like inflammatory bowel disease symptoms and transforming IBS. Working with chronic complex gut conditions has really taught me a lot about how all humans can use food as medicine, both for prevention and cure. Now, I will definitely have a whole episode on what foods are actually medicine, like your garlic, your curcumin, right? But this episode is much more specifically built around food triggers, what food is your medicine versus your poison, which might be totally different than someone sitting next to you. And I want to have a sensitivity warning here. If you are someone who struggles with an eating disorder or restrictive eating, then a blanket episode like this one that highlights elimination diets, it might be triggering for you. So please work with a licensed healthcare professional who can hold a responsible and safe space for you to navigate your own food triggers in a healthy and definitely medically safe way for you. So this might not be your episode if that resonates with you. When I first started practice medicine well over a decade ago, patients would ask me every day, what should I eat? What should I eat, Dr. Kelly? And early on, I learned that there were some tools that might make the invisible visible. I learned pretty quickly that humans like data. Patients like to look at a lab result that says this food is a trigger for you and avoid that food as a result. It wasn't always so easy to convince patients that a food elimination, which is a pretty intense situation, was the first step when I first started working with them. I think I had to build some confidence as a clinician around how important food was. I definitely am very clear on that now. But it was a bit of a journey in the beginning for, okay, I know food is medicine. I know I have to talk to patients about diet, but how am I going to individualize this? And how am I going to show patients what a giant impact the foods that they eat is going to have on their health? So in the beginning, I relied on ALCAT tests or ELISA antibody panels, like IgG panels. And were they perfect? No, definitely. They have some drawbacks. I'm always really clear with patients about the pros and cons, the limitations, the clinical relevance, right? But they were really powerful on ramps to change. They helped people see that food is not just calories, it's information. And your immune system and your nervous system is listening to every single bite of food that you take. Used wisely, those test results were very often a conversation starter. And sometimes in the beginning, I was focusing on supplements or lifestyle changes because I felt like patients were really resistant to changing their diet. We're emotionally tied to food. It can be a really big barrier or obstacle to cure. So, starting with testing that absolutely made it clear that there was something going on with this food and then taking that food out and seeing how patients felt, it made a lot of sense to me as a new physician. We would eliminate foods, we would reintroduce strategically after gut healing, and we would notice how our bodies felt. So, that noticing is truly the medicine. I can't tell you how many times patients have told me over the years that their life changed completely once they knew how specific foods made them feel. Your body is always giving feedback. If you do only one thing from this episode, start paying attention to how you feel after certain foods and know that it might not be an immediate response. So you can start to track with a diet diary where you just write down what you eat, what time it is, and how you feel. And you do that for a couple weeks, and you might start to see patterns, even if the pattern or maybe the symptom or the communication from your body arises a week or two after that food. You'll start to see patterns in that data. I still remember a patient from back in 2013. She and her daughter were two of my first patients ever, and I hold them very dear to my heart. They know who they are, I bet, if I tell this story. We'll call her M. And she had a very clean diet. She was very health savvy. She had what looked like a very clean diet. But she had some hidden sugars in her diet. And when we ran her food sensitivity testing, she was actually sensitive to sugar. And so we removed refined flours and hidden sugars and then some of those indulgent sugars from her diet for, I think we only had done that for about 3 weeks when she started seeing drastic changes. But I know that I typically recommend that we eliminate those foods for a little bit longer. But her morning joint pain dropped in half. She was no longer stiff in her hands. And when she reintroduced some of those more sugar heavy desserts, she did notice that she would get stiffness that would flare within about 12 hours. So she started to learn how much she could indulge in and then prepare for what the symptoms might be if she did decide to do that. And knowledge truly is power in this situation. Sugar swings also are driving cytokines and mast cell activity and inflammation. So even if she weren't sensitive to that food, I think we probably would have talked about that. But again, it's such a wonderful motivational tool when you see in a test result that there's a food that is triggering your immune system or upregulating inflammation. So I want to talk a little bit more about how food is code. Every day, your digestive tract is reading what you eat. You're eating things coming into your body that you're eating are antigens, they're not self. So through digestion and assimilation, you're breaking down proteins and they're becoming peptides and amino acids. You're breaking down fats and carbohydrates. You're absorbing all these nutrients. And your immune system, especially the gut associated lymphoid tissue or GALT, is monitoring all of this. And to our immune system, everything we ingest is by default non self. It is an antigen, it's a foreign invader. So, we've talked a lot before about how your gut from your mouth to your butt is this sealed tube, right? So, anything you're putting into that sealed tube is considered foreign. And a healthy gut and a calm nervous system or a nervous system in that parasympathetic rest and digest state versus sympathetic fight or flight are really going to teach oral tolerance. So, this is our body essentially saying, this is non self. This is not part of me. This is something new entering this tube, but it's safe, right? Tolerance is reinforced by healthy stomach acid levels and enzymes to break our food down so there's not as much antigen, healthy bile flow, gut motility, so your stool and your food moving at the right pace, intact gut mucosa, so healthy integrity of that gut lining, microbiome diversity is so important, and of course, that parasympathetic rest and digest state. So when the terrain is inflamed and your gut is leaky or dysbiotic, the good and bad bacteria is imbalanced, or you have low stomach acid or enzyme production, sluggish bile, or just high stress and high cortisol causing leaky gut, then that same avocado or egg or even wheat that once felt neutral can feel like an attack. And your body starts to respond. Sometimes this is an allergy, an IgE allergy that we'll get into in a minute. Sometimes it's a sensitivity, and sometimes it's an intolerance. This is why I definitely recommend you go back to our episode on Pillar 1 of the Vital Spirit Method. This is why we recognize and remove. We work on the gut-brain axis first, and we recognize the inputs that are being misread. Are there food triggers? Are there allergies that we're consuming? Are there infections or imbalances in the gut? Are there stressors or toxins entering, right? We recognize and remove inflammation. And we remove the biggest sparks to that immune system. So if you have a true food allergy, we're going to remove that in the beginning. Even if the long-term goal is reducing response to a food, especially with sensitivities, which again, we'll get into in a minute, we often start with elimination and pulling that all out to quiet the noise, to repair the intestinal barrier, to really reset the code and the message that your body's getting around food. So I hear all the time from patients, Dr. Kelly, what is the difference between an allergy, a sensitivity, and an intolerance? Or patients will say, I'm allergic to this, or I'm sensitive to that, but they really mean the opposite. Or they'll say, I react to X, Y, and Z food, but they don't quite understand the mechanism underlying that reaction. So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So food allergies. Food allergies are IgE mediated. What that means is that we have immune cells that are responding to that food. These are IgE cells. These, for example, are mast cells that release histamine in response to food. They're immediate reactions, so you might notice hives, swelling, throat tightness, wheezing. When IgE food allergies are higher, they can trigger anaphylactic shock. A true allergy is often lifelong, and you can confirm that with a skin prick, although I do find sometimes patients don't respond to skin prick tests, or an IgE-specific food allergy panel blood test. It's full alarm, mast cell degranulation happening, histamine release. Now, I do run for new patients through Quest, a blood panel that looks at the 14 food allergies that Quest offers to look at. It's obviously not comprehensive, but it's the most common allergies, and I find it very, very helpful. Now, this is different than a food sensitivity. Food sensitivities are often IgG mediated, so a different antibody response. And sometimes I'll also test IgA antibodies, but let's just talk about delayed food sensitivities in the form of IgG antibodies. So these are delayed. Like I said, they can often be hours to days later. So that's why it can sometimes be kind of confusing. Like, I have no idea that I'm sensitive to that food. I didn't notice a direct response right after I ate it. And symptoms can show up anywhere. So you might have gut symptoms like bloating, diarrhea, constipation, abdominal pain. You might have brain fog, headaches or migraines, anxiety or depression. You might have skin symptoms like eczema, hives, acne. You might have joint pain. You might have fatigue. So they really, truly can show up anywhere. And testing can be a little bit inconsistent without terrain context. So this is where gold standard elimination and reintroduction can really shine because it makes it so obvious what your food triggers are. When I first started practicing, I was doing a finger prick IgG test in the office because it was so helpful to say to patients, look, you have a dairy sensitivity. You came up with many, many, many IgG antibody responses to all of this dairy. And then we would eliminate that food. And when you added it back in, you could see how did you respond to adding that food back in. It's pretty straightforward. You feel good or you don't, right? And I would say that on this particular food sensitivity test, the foods that I would see most commonly come up as sensitivity would be dairy, yes, very commonly with skin issues. So almost every eczema patient probably every eczema patient I'm going to talk about dairy, but this was so direct. It was so clear to me to see dairy sensitivity, skin issues. And then gluten is a very common one. On this particular panel, you can look at your gluten response, your gliadin response, your wheat response, your spelt response, your rye response. So you can really get an idea and context of how you're responding to that entire family of foods. Yeast is a common trigger there. I'll often see yeast and gluten as migraine triggers in patients. So there's so much information there. But what do you do with those results? Well, say a patient comes up sensitive to every food, well, then I'm going to explain that part of that is because of leaky gut or intestinal permeability. If you are eating the same foods every day and constantly exposing your body to that food, you're going to get what I call an exposure positive. And if you have leaky gut and those foods are passing through that tube into your bloodstream, well, guess what? You're going to have more IgG sensitivities responding to those foods in the bloodstream. So you have to take these results in context for sure, but you can absolutely use them to guide a short elimination while you heal the gut, while you balance the microbiome, and then ask yourself, how am I feeling with these foods out? And as you add them back in, especially after repairing the gut, you're not going to have as many food sensitivities and you're going to know what foods truly do trigger you. A couple patient examples. I could probably give hundreds of examples of dairy and eczema. So, eczema is a classic example of what's going on the outside of your body being a reflection of what's going on the inside of your body. And dairy is a food that lights up on food IgE allergy panels and/or sensitivity panels in patients with eczema. I could probably give hundreds of examples of this. So, if you're someone that struggles with that, of course, I'm not giving you medical advice here. I'm not your doctor, but you can ask your physician to at least run a food allergy panel and start to figure out if dairy might be a trigger for you. I also want to give another patient example. We'll call her S. And she was in her late 30s and she had migraines every cycle. So every time she had her period, she got a migraine. And she had elevated thyroid antibodies when we first started working together. So both her food allergy and sensitivity panel did flag gluten. I would have had a conversation with her around gluten anyway, given her symptom picture. But we did 6 weeks fully gluten-free and we repaired her gut. And I made sure that she wasn't deficient in any nutrients or minerals. I remember we did utilize some magnesium and her migraines completely went away. So many of my migraine patients are triggered by gluten. So it's not that everyone needs to avoid these foods all the time for the rest of their life. But again, that's the point of running labs. That's the point of an elimination diet. That's the point of healing the gut and then reintroducing and seeing, because ultimately your body is going to tell you yes or no. So we talked about food allergies, IgE allergies. Those are those histamine responses, those true allergies. We talked about IgG sensitivities. You can also have IgA sensitivities. But there's also just food intolerance that's not immune in nature. So digestive or enzymatic. So example of that would be lactose intolerance, right? So you have low lactase, or histamine intolerance. Maybe you have a microbiome issue or you're deficient in the enzyme that breaks histamine down. FODMAP reactivity. So sometimes patients are reactive to foods that ferment in the gut. And definitely low vagal tone is going to create some food intolerance. So it's not necessarily an allergy, it's not a sensitivity, but the body is still saying, nope, this food is not for me. I think histamine is a really interesting one. Histamine intolerance can look like these mystery symptoms like anxiety, like you might get flushing, you might be itchy, you might get heart palpitations, and very, very often a window of time where you're reducing histamine load in the gut and you're figuring out the root cause of that histamine intolerance. But very often these mystery symptoms will clear up. So histamine's kind of a cool one to me. And I just again, have to mention dairy because a lot of patients will come in and say, oh, Dr. Kelly, I couldn't have dairy as a kid, or I got ear infections from dairy, or I got asthma or allergies from dairy as a kid, but I eat it now and I'm fine. Or I'll hear I'm lactose intolerant, but I drink lactose-free milk. Okay, so that might solve the enzyme and sugar issue, the lactose issue, but there's still a protein, casein in dairy that you might have a sensitivity or allergy to. And I promise you that if you couldn't tolerate dairy when you were a baby, you're not tolerating it now. It just doesn't present with the same symptoms that it did when you were a kid. So again, some of the symptoms of intolerance will overlap with the symptoms of a food sensitivity, and they can span the gut and beyond. Don't just think that if your gut feels fine, you don't have an intolerance to a food. So Intolerances might contribute to lowered immune resilience, so getting sick and run down frequently. Definitely gas, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, abdominal pain, IBS type symptoms, fatigue, brain fog, acne, eczema, headaches, migraines, mood changes, anxiety, depression, chronic skin issues, weight gain. In kids, it very often looks behavioral. Food intolerances manifest as behavioral issues. In nursing infants, maternal sensitivities can show up as symptoms in the baby. So these are really important concepts in naturopathic medicine and in the way that I practice medicine to really understand. Now, what drives intolerances? I'm going to lump intolerances and sensitivities together here. Increased permeability, so leaky gut, right? So, as I mentioned before, you'll see higher IgG responses and signals when that barrier is compromised. So, if you have gut inflammation, if you have chronic stress and elevated cortisol, or SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, dysbiosis of the good and bad bacteria, if you have a parasitic or yeast overgrowth or another bacterial infection, low stomach acid or low enzymes, so you're not breaking food down, ultra processed diets for sure, eating the same foods over and over and over on repeat with little variation, too little fiber or short chain fatty acids. All of these are going to compromise the gut and drive food intolerances. The truth and the fact of the matter is that every reaction that your body has to food is terrain feedback. So when the system is dysregulated, tolerance to food is going to decrease. So if we can restore safety and parasympathetic sympathetic balance to the entire terrain, then often we're seeing a reduction in food intolerances. And please, if you are working with someone and they are telling you that food does not matter, find a new doctor, especially if you are working on a chronic GI condition, inflammatory bowel disease, IBS, reflux. If anyone is telling you that the food that you eat, that you put into that sealed tube that then becomes your body, it doesn't matter for any health condition, but especially gut health, skin health, mood, please, no, it matters. What you put in your body, what becomes your body. You do this every day, day in and day out. It is the most important choice that you can make around your health. And every allergic flare or food response or histamine spike is a biochemical message that you're not safe. So, a lot of the work that I'm doing with patients is to help your body remember you are safe, right? Part of this is removing triggers and certainly reintroducing later so you know what food is medicine and what food is poison for you. And certainly retraining that nervous system response while you work on toxic load and burden, while you work on that bucket, right? So you're not overflowing, absolutely. But the key is that your body needs to feel safe. And if you are eating a food that you are creating an immune response to, whether it's an allergy or a sensitivity, every time you eat that food, your body does not feel safe. So I do just want to mention a couple other ways that you can test for food intolerances that you might hear about. Some vitalistic naturopaths are trained in what's called the Carroll method. I'm not currently trained in this, although I think it sounds very helpful in some situations. You might have worked with someone who does applied kinesiology or muscle testing to food responses. Dr. Diadamo, who wrote the blood type diet, he actually taught us at the University of Bridgeport, the School of Naturopathic Medicine, which was kind of cool. And I can do a separate episode on that. But today we're staying on the topic of testing intolerances, sensitivities, and allergies, but there are so many different ways to look into what foods are triggering you. So if you have a practitioner you've worked with and they've helped you figure out what is the best diet for you and your unique health needs on your journey, that's amazing. It doesn't mean you need to go out and run any of these tests. I just want to recommend that you at least have some knowledge around what foods are triggers and what foods are not. So, of course, we're always integrating tests and lab results into what we see clinically or what we experience as the person eating that food, right? We're never taking them in isolation. So, I'm going to correlate a medical history with a food mood symptom journal, with a stool test looking at the microbiome and inflammation, with knowledge around that patient's motility, how often are they having bowel movements, what's their digestion feel like, and most importantly, what are their experiences on a daily basis when they're eating? How aware are they of how food is impacting them, both physically and mentally and emotionally? And when we do utilize therapeutic diet, so maybe a more restrictive diet or an elimination diet or a SIBO diet, it is not forever. And we are always at the end of that reintroducing foods and rebuilding that gut microbiome. That's so key. These eliminations, even if it's of a food that you're allergic or sensitive to, is not necessarily forever. We're going to do the work around healing, and we're going to do the work around figuring out if there are foods that are stay away forever foods, and then how to make sure that we're not losing any nutrients as a result of that elimination, and that we have a really well balanced diet. Now, as I mentioned, despite all the tests that are available or different ways to test our body's response to food, the gold standard is to identify triggers in a structured elimination diet with reintroduction. So, elimination diets will typically last about 2 to 3 weeks, and we're removing likely triggers. I definitely tailor these to each patient. So it's not a one size fits all protocol. But some of the foods that you might be eliminating would be gluten or wheat. Gluten is one of the proteins in wheat. So sometimes people have some confusion around that. Dairy, eggs, soy, corn, peanuts or tree nuts, sesame, nightshades, added sugars or sweeteners, alcohol, sometimes caffeine in this elimination list, and definitely ultra processed additives like dyes and chemicals. If you can maintain that elimination, you're essentially going to get a clean slate. And when you add one food in at a time, you will know what your triggers are. So reintroduction is super methodical. One food at a time. I usually say to patients, you're going to introduce one food at a time and make sure that you expose yourself to it a few times. And then you watch for 2 to 3 days and you track digestion, skin, mood, joints, focus, cognition. And if you react, you can pull the food back out, you can let the symptoms settle, and then you continue challenging the next food. And then you can build a personalized diet from what you tolerate at that point. And certainly after repairing the gut, after working on regulating the nervous system, we can retest. And very often you will see sensitivities clear, and we can retest in the sense of you might not now respond to that food and you may regain tolerance. I'm not going to go super in depth into sublingual immunotherapy here. We can definitely have an episode on that, but I might also be working on desensitizing that patient to that food at the same time. I'm always reminding patients this is not forever. We are learning about your body. We're lowering inflammation. Remember, we're recognizing and removing so that we can add things back in. It really is not forever. Now, there is sometimes when it is forever, and that would be celiac disease and gluten. So gluten is really the quintessential spectrum case, right? So we have a whole spectrum of responses to gluten. So I want to touch on that a little bit. So celiac disease is autoimmune damage to the small intestine. When we are diagnosed with celiac, we are 100% gluten-free for life. It is medically extremely important. That is not everyone. That is celiac. There's also non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This is an innate immune activation. There's no autoimmune damage, but it's also very real. And there are GI symptoms and sometimes symptoms in other parts of the body. Then you have wheat allergy. So remember, that's that IgA-mediated food allergy, that true allergy involving mast cells and histamine. And you can come up positive to a wheat allergy. And then there's gluten or wheat sensitivity, maybe on an IgG test if you're doing that. And then there's just gluten or wheat intolerance. So that might be more based on a leaky gut, digestive issues, vagal tone, microbiome issues that can be resolved. And there's no allergy or autoimmunity component there, but eating it might still feel bad at that point in time. Let's just say there are many biochemical processes. There are many other underlying issues like MTHFR. There's a lot of reasons why I might end up recommending a patient avoid gluten for a period of time. Many non-celiac patients really do thrive removing gluten from their diet. As I've mentioned before, my migraine patients typically we're taking gluten out. Thyroid, we're typically taking gluten out. But so many people will say that they have less bloat, clearer skin, better sleep, way better mood. And there's just so many mechanisms. Gluten does tend to create intestinal permeability or inflammation, leaky gut, even in people who are not sensitive or allergic to it. So I'm not ever going to say that there's a blanket one size fits all diet, but in America, where gluten also has issues with glyphosate, it tends to be in processed foods. If you're at the beginning of your health journey and you can try some gluten free replacements, essentially eating more whole foods and not eating the processed foods, it might be something you consider. So, hope that helps. And I can really say that with such confidence because I've had hundreds and hundreds of patients where we have removed foods, we have worked on their gut brain axis, and they have been drastically better, especially kids with behavioral issues, focus issues. Like I said, obviously digestive issues and skin issues. These are the big ones that if you can figure out what the food trigger is, life is very, very different. And if it's, especially if it's just one food, it's not that big of a deal once you figure it out. So I highly recommend, especially if you have a child of your own and you can't figure out a long-term health issue, just remember how important food is. Now, I keep mentioning how we might be able to reintroduce foods. So what does that mean? What's, in a nutshell, some of the healing processes that we might be engaging in naturopathic medicine to reduce some of these food triggers? So we're definitely going to work on restoring digestion. So making sure that you have adequate stomach acid, that you're making your pancreatic enzymes to break down fat and protein, that you have bile flow, again, to break down fat and protein. You've got great motility, you're moving your bowels through, and a diverse microbiome. So you want to be able to break down your food because your food breaks down, you digest and assimilate, and that food becomes you. It becomes your physical being. And then we certainly, in pillar 1 of the Vital Spirit method, are recognizing and removing those biggest inflammatory inputs. So even without testing, I can easily say that gluten, dairy, corn, sugar, alcohol are going to be the biggest inflammatory inputs to the body. So while we're calming and healing the gut brain axis, those are probably going to come out, right? It just makes sense. And while we're doing this, we are repairing permeability. So we are working on intestinal barrier support. So we're reducing exposure to irritants. We are absolutely looking at the microbiome and certainly removing or getting rid of any overgrowths. We're repleting nutrient deficiencies. We're potentially looking at rebalancing immunity, so supporting Th1, Th2 balance in our immune system, definitely looking at mast cells and histamine response if that's still an issue with a patient. And we're working on regulating the nervous system. So daily vagal toning, breath work, mindfulness, taking moments before you eat to get into that rest and digest state, focusing on sleep, movement, co-regulation with a loved one. Because remember, you can't digest in fight or flight, right? And when healthy digestion is restored and the gut is healed and the microbiome is thriving, then inflammation drops. We see this on labs. We see this in how we feel. And your tolerance and your window of tolerance, both to stress and to inputs in the gut, including food, is going to expand. So you're going to be less reactive and less responsive. And the foods that remain, for some people, there are foods that remain triggers, are the true triggers. They're the true, poisons, quote unquote, for that person. But for plenty of people, their diet can expand once the gut is healed. And I just want to touch on one of the ways that I learned to be pretty strict about diet in the beginning, essentially, is that early on in my career, I was seeing a lot of inflammatory bowel disease patients, Crohn's, colitis, definitely IBS patients. And they were told for the IBD patients that the only path for them was steroids or immune suppressants. And IBS patients were essentially told there's nothing to do, right? But I was determined, and this was a population that I was working with a lot at the beginning of my career. And I really, really noticed that if we were able to remove those inflammatory foods, if we were able to identify some of the other autoimmune bonfire triggers or stress triggers, especially in the IBS patients, these were the patients I had the best success with. They were so happy. They were amazed. They were telling all their friends about it. So it just made sense to me that if I was able to have such great results with patients who put in the work that had these chronic digestive issues, then why wouldn't I apply that knowledge to other healing processes and to other patients I was working with? And that's in part how the Vital Spirit method was born, right? So, in everyone, we're going to recognize and remove sources of inflammation, right? We're going to clear dysbiosis and overgrowth, whether that's bacterial, fungal, parasitic. We're going to repair the barrier with collagen, maybe glutamine, maybe zinc carnosine, demulcent herbs. We're going to re-inoculate and feed the microbiome. We're going to utilize fibers, plants, resistant starches, right? We're going to support short chain fatty acids that heal and seal the gut lining. We're going to support motility and make sure that we also don't have excessive motility and excess bowel movements. We want to make sure that we're moving our bowels at a regular rhythm every single day. We want to layer in nervous system work. We're working on the vagus nerve. We're, again, focused on that gut brain axis with every patient. And in hundreds of patients, I have watched flares go away, long remissions, patients able to come off medications, again, with the guidance of their prescribing physician, patients able to avoid said medications, IBS symptoms cleared, better moods, bodies that felt safer, less confusion around what to eat, what not to eat, what's going to trigger me, what's not going to trigger me. And in the end, a much wider diet with so much more variety and way less symptoms. And no, we're not trying to suppress symptoms. We were using symptoms as guides. So imagine if we had been suppressing the immune system, I wouldn't know what foods were actually triggering that patient. So we're really working with the terrain and working with the body. And I truly felt if reversing these incurable patterns is possible by restoring terrain, then this is the type of preventive medicine and optimal health that I wanted to apply to women's health and hormones and the HPA axis. So this is why we always start with the gut-brain axis in Pillar 1. And just remember, if a test disagrees with your lived experience, your body always wins. We listen to our body. So if you just wanted some general advice or recommendations on things that you can do to maybe reduce food intolerances, one would be start your morning with breakfast and making sure that you have stable glucose and therefore steadier cortisol. So we don't have any blood sugar drops and cortisol spikes. So start your morning with protein and healthy fat and ideally some plants. And then eat in parasympathetic state, right? So pause the scroll, put your screen down, try 3 slow nasal breaths, chew, practice some gratitude before your meal, and then your body's getting the message that you're safe and you're ready to digest. And if you're excited to try an elimination diet, then know that the reintroduction phase is the most important part. So lots of people, they get through the elimination and they want to rush the reintroduction. Don't rush it. One food at a time. Pay attention to how you feel. If you react, step away. Go back to repair for a week or two and then try again. And the goal is to regain variety. Remember, we want to have 30 plus plant foods a week and train the vagus nerve daily. Your parasympathetic tone is so important to not overreact or respond to food antigens. So humming, singing, chanting, slow breathing, yoga, lay on the floor and just breathe. Just be in your body. All of this is so good for our vagal tone. And feed that healthy microbiome. So build toward diverse fibers. If you're not used to fiber, you can start with cooked and you can add raw in later. And definitely consider simple fiber supports like psyllium. I love flax. You know, I love hemp seed. I talk about it all the time for women's heart and hormone health. So even just adding some extra fiber, all of these are going to help reduce your intolerances. And if you are maybe struggling with more of a histamine response, you can always incorporate things like natural mast cell stabilizers. So you've got your vitamin C and your quercetin. I will very often utilize demulcent mucilaginous herbs like marshmallow, slippery elm. So they're calming and soothing the GI tract. As I mentioned, I might use things like glutamine for healing and sealing that gut lining and focus on prebiotic diversity, fiber variety, and really optimizing those short chain fatty acids like butyrate, for example, which goes in and heals and seals that gut lining. You certainly might use targeted probiotics, maybe based on your own stool test, and certainly anti-inflammatory herbs like turmeric, curcumin. I love my ginger for gut healing. Like I said, this episode is not on that, but I do want to mention a couple of these. Certainly getting enough omega fatty acids in the diet will keep inflammation down and reduce excessive immune response to foods. And I would recommend that if you do struggle with a lot of what you think might be food sensitivities or allergies or intolerances, definitely if you have a lot of histamine type symptoms, that you look into a more advanced stool test, you look into a food allergy or sensitivity panel. And remember, natural therapies are not a substitute for emergency care in the case of anaphylaxis. So I'm not saying to utilize these things if you're someone who needs an EpiPen. That's clearly an emergency. So, if this has sparked some curiosity in you, I definitely recommend you go back to the episode where we talk about Pillar One, the gut brain axis, where we recognize and remove inflammation. And then you can go on to learn all about Pillar Two, where we regulate and restore healthy nervous system response and the HPA axis. So, as our terrain is calmer, as we're not overreacting essentially to stress inputs, we're not going to overreact to the food we put in our body. But we also have to have that healing phase where we're pulling out inflammation so that the body can heal. So this is the basis of the vital spirit method and something I do with all new patients. So if you want a gentle place to start, you can grab your free Seeds of Health journal and you can start to track some patterns there, and even my free vagal tone guide, and you can start getting more into that healing state so that your body is less reactive. And please remember, I know I mentioned, food as medicine and food as poison, but food is not the enemy. Eating should be joyful. It's such an amazing experience as a human to eat delicious food, right? But food is a mirror. Your response to food really reflects your current capacity for digestion, for trust in the environment, for feeling safe. And I think if we're able to approach food as a relationship, not just a set of rules like good, bad, then your body meets you there and inflammation calms and quiets and tolerance returns and these sensitivities decline and you feel more like yourself and you have the freedom to eat more things. And that's ultimately my goal with patients. But I really want them to know what it feels like to feel amazing and what it feels like to eat foods that match with our health goals. And food is such a powerful lever, and patients' lives are legitimately changed when they are able to connect with how they feel is being related to the food that they eat. It is a giant step in your health awakening journey. To be fully human and deeply healed isn't about eating perfectly. Definitely enjoy your food, right? But it is about restoring safety into your system. It is about knowing what foods are your medicine and what foods are your unique poison. So if you know someone who's struggling with, what do I eat? I don't know what foods are my triggers. I don't know what to do. I'm so confused. Or my doctor told me food doesn't matter. Please share this episode with them and download and subscribe so that you don't miss any more. I hope this was helpful in clarifying what all these different tests are and why they might be used and what some of their limitations are. Until next time, stay rooted and vital.